Hi, this is Mary from the Daily Sew. As we discussed in the last video, how to cut out a sewing pattern, there's a lot of information in a pattern and it's there to guide you from the very beginning to all the way to a successful garment. It does a very good job, except there's one step, and it's kind of a big one, that they sort of just leave you to it. And cutting out your fabric does seem natural enough, right? You just go and cut it. But there are a few key points to know and follow in order to avoid some costly mistakes. Like cutting out very expensive wool fabric so badly it's completely ruined. True story. So this video is all about how to cut out your fabric and your pattern so you can avoid those mistakes. So if you're ready, let's go. So after you've decided on your pattern and your fabric, the next step is pre-treating your fabric. You're going to treat it as you're going to treat the garment after you sew it. So if I know I want to throw this skirt in the washer and dryer, after checking the fiber care instructions for the fabric, I'm going to wash and dry it before cutting it out. Remember, treat the fabric as you will the garment, and do it now to wash away the finishing chemicals, relax the fibers, and pre-shrink it before you take any time to sew something with it. If I was making the t-shirt, I know that I want that to go through the washer and the dryer, so I will put that fabric through the washer and dryer before I cut it. Let's say you are using a fabric that cannot go in the washer or the dryer, like wool. It still needs to be treated before sewing. You can take the fabric to a dry cleaner and have them pre-shrink it, because that's what the care label says for wool. Or what I like to do is lay the fabric out flat and iron it quite a bit using a lot of steam. The steam kind of shrinks the wool, gets all the shrinkage out of it. You want to read the fiber content and any care instructions when you buy the fabric. It's on the end of the bolt, that's where you're going to find it, and you can follow guidelines or of course look it up. After pre-treating, you need to press the fabric flat. Why? Because cutting a pattern across wrinkles is going to give you a jagged line, which is going to affect the construction. Some fabrics will never be completely wrinkle-free, but you just do your best, because the cut line is used to get an accurate seam line, and an accurate seam line gives you an accurate fit. Again, check the fiber content to set the iron's heat to match. Your fabric is washed, dried, and pressed, and now let's check to see if it has a nap. Or, in other words, does the fabric have a direction? This print has an obvious direction. All the houses are going one way, and when I sew it, I don't want some of my houses upside down on the finished project. So I need to pay attention when cutting out my pattern. This is called fabric nap, and I do have a video about that. Corduroy also has a nap. It is solid, but the pile is going to look lighter or darker depending on the direction. Is it going up or is it facing down? Some plaids are symmetrical like this and can be cut out in either direction. Other plaids are asymmetrical and therefore have a nap. The fish in this print, they face up, down, left, right, so there is no obvious direction. You can either choose which way is up for you, or you can ignore it and cut out the pieces randomly. Next, go to the pattern instructions and check for the layout guide. Is the fabric shown folded, and if so, how? Where, according to the layout, do the selvage edges go? The selvage edge is the woven edge of the fabric, and the other edge, usually the shorter edge, is the cut edge, where the fabric was cut off the bolt when you bought the fabric. This layout shows a single layer of fabric. It is not folded at all. So your fabric comes in one long piece when you buy yardage, right? So you fold and cut out the pieces in the left layout guide, and then you open up the fabric and cut out the pieces on the guide on the right. You're going to read the guides as you do word, left to right. Check that you have the correct layout guide for the style and size you're sewing and for the width of your fabric. They will vary. My guide says to fold the fabric lengthwise, so let's do that. So this is the cut edge, which may or may not line up with each other after you fold it. This is the selvage edge. It is a woven edge. It is not fraying like a cut edge. On printed fabrics, there's typically a white margin on the selvage. Usually it's a narrow margin, but this one is wide, and that of course is unusable. So you want to watch that you don't lay your pattern pieces in the margins. So be sure your fabric is lying flat and smooth. If the fold is lying flat and the selvages are lined up, your fabric is probably on grain. If the fold has diagonal lines and wrinkles coming from it, your fabric may be off grain and you need to tug on it at a 45-degree angle to get it back on grain. And sometimes you just need to adjust the top layer until the fabric is smooth at the fold. Whether you cut your fabric right side up or upside down is a personal preference. I usually cut with the right side up, especially with prints, so that I can lay the pattern pieces out on the print and have control over where the print goes on the finished garment. But double check your layout guide because sometimes it has to be done face up or face down. With woven fabrics, remember, the grain line is king. You must follow the grain line of the fabric and the pattern pieces. This line with the arrow and marked grain line is the grain line. There will be a grain line marked on every pattern piece. The pattern grain line always goes lengthwise in the same direction as the selvage edges of the fabric and not the cut edge. That's the cross grain. It doesn't mean the pattern piece is laid lengthwise, but the grain line drawn on it is, unless in rare instances it says otherwise, but it will tell you. If you ignore the grain line on the pattern when cutting it out, say you place it across or just randomly, your finished garment isn't going to hang from the body as it was designed to hang. It's going to twist or shift awkwardly. If you ever had a t-shirt where the side seams twisted to the front and the back, it was cut off grain. So pay attention to the layout guide and the grain line. By the way, if your patterns are too wrinkly, you can press them. Just be sure to use a dry iron on the lowest setting. And be sure it is dry because steam and paper do not mix. So what about laying out knit fabric? Knit fabrics also have a selvage and a cut. But the rule for knit fabric is, not grain line, but the direction of the most stretch. This fabric is a four-way stretch fabric, meaning it should stretch the same amount both across the fabric and along the fabric. A normal t-shirt knit will stretch in both directions, but it stretches more going across the fabric. Your pattern pieces will be laid out on the fabric so the direction of the most stretch goes across the body. This layout shows the fabric folded so the selvage edges meet in the middle and both the front and the back shirt pieces are cut on the fold. But because knit fabrics can be slippery and hard to keep them smooth, I like to cut them out with a single layer of fabric. If it isn't obvious to you, you can tell the right side from the wrong side of a knit because the cut edge will almost always curl toward the right side of the fabric. To cut on a single layer of fabric, you're going to need a whole pattern and not half of a pattern designed to be cut on the fold to make a whole piece. And to make a whole pattern is quite easy. You just trace off the pattern piece on a large sheet of paper, fold the paper on the edge that is labeled Place on Fold, and you cut it out as one, like cutting out a paper heart. And then you unfold it and you have a whole pattern to cut. Of course, you can tape pieces of paper together to get a piece large enough. Whole patterns are the only way I cut out shifty and slippery fabric, woven or knit. Whole patterns and a single layer of fabric also allow you to control and match up the print placement. This way you can place the pattern on the stripes so that both pieces, when sewn together, the stripes will line up along the seam line, which is a really nice detail. Follow your layout guide when placing your pattern pieces onto your fabric for cutting. But if you have a direction to your fabric or think you might, and the layout guide doesn't count for that, make sure all the tops of your pieces are going to the left or right of the fabric and all the bottoms in the opposite. Basically, all your pattern pieces are laid in the same direction. Pieces that need to be placed on the fold should be placed first. I always start with the larger pieces and they are placed right up on the fold. Other pieces can be placed anywhere on the fabric. Just look at your guide. But their grain line must follow the length grain of the fabric along the selvage and in most cases the fold. Usually, almost always, you can eyeball if your piece is following the grain, but when it matters to you, please feel free to get out the ruler and measure from the selvage or the fold to the printed grain line in a few spots on the pattern piece. I do this with large pattern pieces, usually because it suits my sewing style. However, I have had eye rolls directed at me when the ruler comes out, but each his own. So there are 3 ways to cut out your pattern pieces, both using pattern weights or pins. Let's start with securing the pattern to the fabric. When using weights, first place the weights in the middle of the piece and slide them out one at a time to the edges. You want to be sure to secure the edge up against the fold, the corners, and the curves more than anything else. You do not need a lot of weights. Method 1 is tracing the pattern with fabric chalk. You trace around the pattern and mark where any notches are, lift the pattern piece off, and cut it out with the scissors. The second approach is pinning the pattern piece to the fabric. You want to secure the far corners first, making sure the pattern is flat. You will probably need to readjust and repin, and do so if needed. Secure the edge along the fold and the corners. I place my pins perpendicular to the edge of the pattern, especially in the corner. Some people place pins parallel to the edge. I used to think they were totally wrong, but now I realize they think I'm wrong. So again, each their own. Whichever direction, you don't need a lot of pins. You will need more pins along a curve though. When done, you cut out the pattern. The third approach to cutting a pattern requires a cutting mat. You slip the mat under your fabric, make sure it covers your pattern piece, or you can butt 2 mats together. Place your weights on the pattern and cut with a rotary cutter. Don't use a rotary cutter without a cutting mat. You'll have to use scissors instead. If you find when you cut you're not getting a smooth cut line, you may want to try this trick. Cut to the left of the pattern if you are right-handed, and to the right of the pattern if you are left-handed. It does work for me. It may not work for everybody. Never cut in the air. It distorts the shape of the piece you are cutting. So shifty or slippery fabric can be very challenging to cut. You need a lot of patience no matter what method you use. I like to use a rotary cutter and the mat because it lays flat. If you use scissors, try laying your palm down next to where you are cutting as you cut to tame some of the shiftiness. And really slippery fabrics, you are better off putting a sheet of paper underneath the fabric. Then you put your fabric on top and then your pattern pieces, and you cut the fabric and the paper as one. And it really helps tame the slippery and shiftiness of slippery fabrics. And after cutting out any piece, be sure to make a small snip where notches are marked on the pattern. And remember, do not cut where you placed it on the fold. So mark your notches, but also mark your dots. I stick a pin straight through the dots on the pattern piece and both layers of fabric. Then I peel the fabric back carefully and I mark with the fabric marker on the wrong side of the garment where the pin is. Because where the pin is where the dot is, and where the dot is important when I go to sew. So this is disappearing ink, and that means I'm going to have to sew this soon after I mark it. Or I could mark with tailor's chalk. It comes in all different colors, and you could even mark it on the right side of the fabric. Just don't iron it. There are many different ways to mark your fabric, and I'm going to have a video on that soon. The important thing is to get the information transferred from the pattern to the fabric. Well, I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions about cutting, including what are my favorite scissors and pins, put it in the comments below and I'll be sure to reply. If you like this video, why not give it a thumbs up and maybe even subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.